This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight once again Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck. Thank you for being here.
Not at all.
Well, we talk about a lot of things and a lot of issues that confront the American people these days. Mm-hmm. And one of them is the increasing notion that the society is not fair, and there's an enormous amount of financial inequality in the country. And in fact, the statistics are out there that seemingly the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and this is a long-term problem.
Yes, sounds like the French government a few hundred years ago. Yeah.
And philosophers have opined on this, and there are arguments out there. There's some fundamental flaws in the capitalist system that are producing these I guess, unethical disparities in wealth.
Yes.
Now, do you have a comment on that? I'll throw you the first pitch
yes.
there.
Well, I suppose my opening comment would be a cartoon that I once saw in a professor's office of three fish swimming in a row. A small fish who is about to be eaten by a larger fish who is about to be eaten by the largest fish of all.
Yes.
And the small fish is thinking to himself, the world is not just.
Yes.
And the middle fish is thinking, the world is somewhat just.
Yes.
And the large fish that's about to consume everything is thinking to himself, the world is just.
Yes.
So that's my response to the opening pitch.
So if the system is rewarding, there are plenty of shekels dropping in your tin cup, it seems pretty good. If it's not the case, it seems progressively
the best of all possible worlds,
less fair. Well, I mean, if we go look into the historical sort of roots of things, I mean, the capitalist system was not always what it is, and I think the church had some initial thoughts against usury or the idea of interest being paid, and I think that's still the case in Islamic countries. I mean, it's a fundamentally kind of a tricky thing that money grows from money.
Yes.
I mean, and do you have thoughts on that? I mean, the Catholic Church particularly.
Yes,
I mean, had some ideas against that.
Yes. High interest rates were very much frowned upon. And if we go back earlier than that, if we go all the way back to the earliest days of the church, in the first chapters of the book of Acts, you actually see a communal system being tried out by the Christian communities, and it didn't work out so well because if I remember correctly, some of the people involved in the system were skimming. So that didn't work out so well. But yeah, we have this tension between what is good for the community and what is good for the individual, and the possibility that what is good for the individual may be good for the community in at least a trickle-down kind of way. So it makes it a difficult issue.
I don't want to take our conversation in too arcane areas, but Max Weber, the idea of the Protestant ethic, and so at least some of the thoughts that were out there, is that the Reformation allowed, along with other things,
the release of energy,
right, and the idea that obtaining wealth could be a sign that you were part of the elect, possibly,
Correct.
And then you could do good with the wealth, and you had moral responsibilities to have the wealth.
Yes.
So it would totally walking away from the good that wealth could do was I guess something would be morally incorrect in some circles in Northern Europe in the 17th century, shall we say.
Correct. And of course, this idea, the Protestant work ethic, was transplanted to America with the Puritans and the Separatists, and was tremendously influential. And to take an example, if you see what John Harvard did with his money in Massachusetts in the 1630s, that they established the first true corporation in North America, which today continues to exist as your alma mater.
Yes, it does. Yes. So we can make some comments about that. And
all
right. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about the Pilgrims. So the idea that I guess the traditional idea was that the Pilgrims were religious folk that were coming to America to exercise religious freedom and to have their own spiritual paradiso there. But in fact, they were being subsidized by merchant adventurers. So the idea is, we'll send you guys over there, but the idea is you send us some beaver skins back. You may want to go for your religious experience, but we're going to pay for your way over there with a caveat that it's a money deal.
Yes.
And you could say the same, particularly for Virginia. So really,
especially so,
more so. I mean, but not necessarily if you look at the whole sort of second generation situation in New England. I mean, the people were very mercantilely inclined.
Yes.
So there's been this duality, I guess you could say. What's what I'm trying to get into a little bit, the duality between between obtaining money and the moral evil that could be associated with it.
Yes, I just had to add a little bon mot there. We can't leave the Quakers out of this. We can't leave Pennsylvania out. Who was it that said that in the colonial times that a Quaker is a person who prays for you on Sundays and prays on you the other 6 days of the week?
That's pretty clever. Yes, and well, actually, often religious minorities are in those circumstances.
Yes.
Well, I mean, so we have this duality, do we not? There's still a bit of suspicion about that. And it appears to me the way the resolution has taken place in America is that if you actually, it's from the sort of the Protestant, well, I mean, it's too narrow to say that, but in fact, you could be a far encompassing kind of national ethos that you can get money, that's good, but you have to redistribute that money. It would be bad if you got $1 zillion and you just sort of like Scrooge McDuck, you rolled around in your your swimming pool with dollar bills, but the idea would be sort of the Rockefeller viewpoint. You recycled all this money, and you did good works with it.
Yes,
and that was
is another good example of that. The Carnegie Libraries, and yet look what he did. I mean, the ruthless capitalism.
Yes.
The abuses that a raw, unregulated capitalist system allows. That's how he made the money. When the Homestead riot took place at the Homestead Steel Mill, I think in 1892, and Carnegie freely, happily employed Pinkertons to shoot up the scabs. And the story is that when Carnegie heard that the strike had been broken and that there had been deaths galore, he said, ladies and gentlemen, God is in his heaven and all is right with the world.
Yes, yes.
And yet then he turns around and gives back.
So if I could say it this way, I mean, it's quite complicated to get into a discussion of the moral dimensions of capitalism. It's far past our short time on our little show tonight to talk about it. But there's a lot of the idea, if you were going to defend capitalism, you would say, well, firstly, you have this recycling kind of thing. You could say and the obligation for charity and moral connection sort of makes the system work. It would not work if people shot the workers and then just kept the money and just lived this sort of inelegant life with, I don't know, drugs and all the cornucopia of excess.
Yes.
That would be a bad thing.
At some point it would have to break down.
It would be a bad thing. I mean, it's right. And on the other, that would be, so as long as capitalism had this moral dimension to it, that would be okay. The other point that's made, I think, is, and made persistently, that a capitalist system really raises all the boats there.
Yes.
It turns out it's an extremely effective way to generate more wealth in the world,
yes.
and far better than the government can do.
Yes.
And so those seem to be central arguments
yes.
that would support that.
Well, let me ask you this, moving away from America a little bit. I know you're fascinated with Chinese culture. You've had a lot of interactions with the Chinese medical community
yes,
lately. But aren't the Chinese essentially in their economic system becoming Hamiltonians as opposed to Leninists or Marxists? Because they have recognized just what you've said.
Yes, it is a very complicated kind of story, and this goes into what words do and don't mean. So you could say that person is a communist. You could use that word. But actually, what a communist was in 1917 and what a communist is in Shanghai and 100 years later just about, is that even though the words are the same, it's a totally different, has a totally different meaning.
Yes.
And I think the China has been unleashed in many ways, just taken off like a rocket ship with the idea that personal gain is possible. And the the inequalities in wealth there are absolutely stunning.
Yes.
And so we have this kind of complicated choices in the world, and it appears to me, having sort of taken the conversation along this way, the idea is that the way we're making our system work is that we're doing substantial income redistribution. So the system is, well, we're going to let capitalism flourish. We're going to hope the people that make a lot of money give it away, and we'll allow the tax system to encourage that. We'll encourage that, and then if that's an inadequate arrangement, then the government will take money from those high flyers and recirculate the money to people that there's nothing in there, or not enough in their tin cup.
Yes.
That seems to be the idea that's out there.
Well, when you look at the chunk of the pie that entitlements take out of the national budget, they're certainly doing it to a great degree. I'm reminded of something that Bill Clinton said when he was president. I can't remember exactly when. I think it was during his first term, when he said that we need to think of taxes as our contribution to America. And he was very derided at the time for saying that, because the difference in a contribution and a tax is a contribution, and I've used this before in this program, the free market individualism, civil libertarianism is a system in which the individual says, I shall do this, I shall not do that. Whereas an authoritarian system or a socialist system is when the government says to the individual, you shall do this or you shall not do that. And so the idea of tax as contribution is almost an Orwellian confusion of terms.
And so just to talk about that, I mean, so okay, I've said, well, it seems reasonable if you were going to write on the back of a napkin, well, this system, that'll make the system work. But the problem is if these arrangements become too extreme. So I think we can look at the example of our European confreres, their system they have, and in many ways the idea is that the government really does play a huge role in income redistribution, and along with that, there's a real paucity of charity there. So if the government takes all of the money out of the system, it becomes the moral arbitrator of the country, and you could say it weakens the traditional role of religion and churches.
Yes.
So and it also I think diminishes the social bond between people.
Yes.
Which so you could say if the government is excessive, it causes these imbalances, and to continue talking about that. The system that seemingly had the most enormous blow-up in the 20th century was the Soviet Union, the communist system there,
Yes.
which was pursuing equality to the nth degree, so that all wealth was pretty much taken up by the state and redistributed. So it became impossible for anyone to do anything, and at the same time, the government suppressed any kind of organized religion, so that ship went extraordinarily in one direction, and the system did not work. It just totally it blew up. That won't work, really.
Yes, and it's amazing. And my wife, who is a Russian historian, of course, said when the Cold War ended, she said, "This is exactly how I figured the Soviet Empire would collapse. I just did not see it coming so soon and so quickly." But you're absolutely right. So yeah, we have a linked sense of responsibility and authority for making the money as well as letting the money go. But when the government steps in and says, in both regards, you shall do this, you shall not do that, all sense of personal autonomy goes away on both sides of the ledger.
So
what do you do with that?
It seems to me the sense of balance is a very important one. And the other thing that happens, I think the other danger in the system of massive government-directed income redistribution is the idea that you've got tyrants that way.
Yes.
So if you have a democratic process, this is, I think Aristotle talked about that. You have the way that the democracy evolves is it finally gets to the point where if the government can redistribute wealth totally, and I'll use the Greek word, the tyrant, can take that money and give it to his supporters, then he'll buy support from,
Yes.
and if he can buy over 51%, he can stay in power in perpetuity and inevitably be corrupted.
Yes.
So what will finally happen is the system will implode, referable to the tyrant will turn into some kind of, I guess, a king, an inherited king,
Yes.
kind of like North Korea, if you want to
Yes.
use that example.
Good point. But let's try the variation on that, whereas we can think of the tyrant as not an individual, but as whoever the sovereign is. And if the people are the sovereign, then we come to that statement, the provenance of which is greatly debated, but that democracy ends when the people realize they can vote themselves largesse out of the public treasury. So what happens?
And of
after
course,
that?
you know,
Yes.
so we have this, what I'm searching for is the idea that balance is needed, and the idea that some inequality is inevitable, if I can phrase it that way. And you could say you can't, for many reasons, a very huge world. It's very difficult to find places where firstly, people, I would submit, are not equal in their abilities they have. Where they're tall, they're short. I mean, they may be spiritually the same. They're under God, they're equal, and they have similar souls, and you have to respect their divine origin.
Equality of opportunity.
Right, but the ability. Some people can shoot jump shots at 50 feet out.
It's not fair, though.
Well, we'll talk about that. But so we have this real disparity of just gifts. The gifts, and then there's also, you could say, there's a disparity in the environment people grow up in. So even if you had tremendous, gifts, your IQ is 1,200 or whatever, some huge number, and you grew up in a sort of a demented place with, drugs around and no particular cultural pressure on you
Yes.
to pursue your advantages, then that would not be fair. So you have this inevitable inequality that exists, and there's going to be some kind of inequality to some degree in the amount of benefits each person is going to receive from the system. And that seems to be a sort of a given.
Yes. Perhaps if capitalism or the internal forces of the individual which drive capitalism could be internally regulated, if everyone had the sense of being able to give something back, or even the majority had the sense of being able to give something back, the state would not have to, the state or whatever the state is, the rest of the people would not feel as driven to jump in and regulate it. But it's interesting that you see people who are good at making money, at making something of themselves, often have that quality to excess. They have that greed.
Yes.
And they don't stop at a certain point, and they keep on collecting. But then, isn't it selfishness on the part of the tyrant or of the people who jump in and try to grab some of that away?
Yes.
So
yes.
it's all driven by selfishness.
Yeah. Let's discuss that a little bit. So, it appears to me that if you accept the way humans are, I'm going to say they have different sets of abilities and gifts, and there's going to be a corresponding some kind of variance in just the cornucopia of the world, referable to that in some way. I mean, if you could shoot great jump shots, you're going to be rewarded a little bit.
Still not fair.
So, we'll get into that, but the system that failed, the Soviet system that failed, was the assumption that people would arbitrarily surrender their financial resources, whatever they had.
Yes.
They would just say, in a very pure and spiritual way, it's true enough, I've got all these things, but I don't need them, and I'm going to give them to this person that does need them.
Yes.
And correspondingly, there would be people that would say, I'm only going to ask for something if I really need it.
Yes.
I would never ask for something I don't need. And so the assumption was in the Soviet system that you would have these perfect humans, that the system would work if you had perfect humans like that, with the additional caveat, there would be no divine sanctions on immoral behavior. The only thing that's going to make this happen is the intrinsic goodness of people and the idea that the people that were evil had been cast out, and so that the remaining citizens of the Soviet Union. All the aristocrats and lords and malefactors of wealth had either been killed or left the country. And so only the pure people that had been suppressed would have the temple, have the kingdom, and they would be necessarily pure, and they would stay that way. But it turned out that was a terrible reading of human nature.
I mean, isn't that, I mean, I try to be fair and balanced, as a certain large network says, but isn't that a simply naive view of human nature?
Absolutely, it's naive.
I mean, isn't selfishness hardwired into our biology? Isn't what we are doing on a metabolic level, is
Yes.
we are wired to take things in our environment that are not us and make them into us by
Yes.
consuming it. You cannot get away from selfishness.
Yes, and even in the most, the moral failings of our species, even in the purest of places, I mean, monastery or whatever, I mean, there are tensions that exist there, and they're the human nature.
The Book of Acts, it didn't even work then.
The nature of humans
Yes.
just it constantly expresses itself, and it's a hopeless thought that we're going to have a system where things are going to be okay.
Yes.
Now, and if we attempted to change the system substantially, which might be appropriate, you'd still have to say, well, who's going to live in the palace? Look at the Cuban situation.
Yes.
Are you going to get corrupt after a while? And the story is you are going to get corrupt
Yes.
after a while.
Yes,
And
you've got an
people-
animal farm situation.
That's right.
So-
It's exactly an animal. So you have to make do with human nature, and to get this resolved. But what is a moral person to do if they confront these a reasonable? I'll put the other point. A reasonable moral person, which is an unusual creature, I would say.
Yes.
But what should we do about that? We have people that have so much, and if the system is not regulate, presumably what would happen if there was no government interference in a pure capitalist state? I'll ask that question,
Yes.
and I think this is there are economists that say this: pure capitalist state, no, there would be no redistribution of wealth. All of the wealth would soon be concentrated in the hands of relatively few people, and everyone else would be in the state of servitude, just about economic servitude, or they would just basically die, and it would depend on the largesse of those people that possess the wealth.
Well, here's a proposition. Have you not described largely where we are in the United States today, with the proviso that it is due to the tremendous technological advances brought to us by the robber barons that have raised all the boats, that a great number of the people in America today whom we would call poor, who are certainly below the poverty line, and yet a large percentage of them have refrigerators, they have microwaves, they have smartphones. So, I mean, I don't mean to
Yes.
sound bad about this, but the boats all have lifted. Do they have as much as Bill Gates? Absolutely, by no means.
Yes.
But they do have more than what we would have thought the poor would have had 150 years ago. And yet, might it get worse since the wealth continues?
Yes, yes.
That you have limits on the type of job you can get. You have limits on your bargaining power,
Yes,
your
yes,
negotiating
right,
authority.
Yes.
So you are very limited in terms of your options in life and your ability to claw your way out of that subsistence level.
Yes.
What do you do about it?
Well, that's a good question, and I'll expand the question a little bit. And I think one of the most important words to brood about, I think Americans should think about the word fair. So if someone is using the word fair, you really have to probe the definition of the word fair. And it's interesting to hear how common politicians toss this word around. But it requires a lot of parsing out exactly what this does and doesn't mean. And
It's
to
a
me-
weasel word.
Yeah, well, to me, one of the things that's the most unfair, if you want to look at it, is the maldistribution of resources on the earth. So if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, you look at Latin America or India, there are many places, the situation is just not fair. If you're born in America, you've got all of these advantages, and you have this sort of economic floor put in. If you're born in another country, you just don't have that, and there doesn't seem to be an overwhelming desire to people that want to redistribute wealth within our borders. it's not a common thing to want to send the wealth elsewhere, where the disparity is even greater.
Yes.
So, but that seems to be a central world problem. If
Yes.
we're really going to talk about the world and the fact that we're encountering this system of inequality, and it's very disturbing. You mentioned a system. What's it like to just be trapped on the bottom? I mean, it's very unpleasant. I mean,
Yes.
all these opportunities are blocked. There's a sense of debasement that it can occur.
Yes.
And so right-thinking people would like to say, well, we want our society to be a better place, and yet it's not a national problem; it's a world problem. And then what do you do about that? And it's often contrary to just our selfish nature to give something arbitrarily to another person just for no particular reason. I mean, there's no moral commitment to do it. It's just taken from us.
Well, you do see some some internationalist movements in this direction, and I'd have to leave to someone more knowledgeable to eyes to whether or not it's actually going to work out. But the IMF, for instance, or the idea that developing countries are destroying the rainforests, and it's the tragedy of the commons, and these rainforests are good for all of the world. So maybe all of the world, including the developed countries, need to put a fund in to spread around the cost of keeping the rainforest preserved. Or could we have some sort of national fund saying our GDP is X and sub-Saharan African nations' GDP is Y, so let's just dump everything in a fund and break it down per capita as opposed to how much money we make versus how much money they make. Would any of these work? Would anybody agree to sign on to them? Would Americans agree to it? If we tried to come up with a new world order to have a world economy with a fair distribution of assets.
Well, you mentioned the fish, the big fish
Yes.
that started out. Well, Americans pretty much are the big fish.
Yes.
So the system they
world
only
is just.
they will, and there's sort of a limited discussion about what people want to do, and the people might say, well, then in America, I want these benefits and whatever, and that's going to make things fairer. But the notion of fairness ends at the national border,
Yes.
Which is a sort of a paradoxical.
That's artificial, though. It's very artificial.
It's a very paradoxical viewpoint, and it emphasizes, I think, the idea that many people would use this moral argument for self-advantage as opposed to sort of a broader ethical construct.
Can't get away from the selfishness.
That's
in other
right,
words.
and so there's a selfishness in morality, isn't there?
Yes, and it also, I think, that points up the importance of community. That a lot of the things you were talking about, especially at the beginning of our time here, was the tension between the individual and the community, the giving back to community. And this is something I've raised before. Are human beings individuals, or are they members of community that does have a just claim on something of theirs? So I hear you saying that, yes, we really are part of a community, but then the question becomes, what is the community? Is it the community of humanity, including the impoverished nations, or is the community simply this construct called the United States of America, beyond whose borders, if you live beyond those borders, we have no duty to you at all? So.
And you've used an interesting word, duty, which I
Yes.
think we've talked about before.
Indeed.
And so if we sort of plot our way through this, I mean, I want to go back as we conclude here, the idea of balance, and then how do we balance things out? And it seems to me the system, is imperfect as it is doing some kind of job toward redistribution of wealth. There are some redistributions going on, and it's taking a little bit of the sting out of the system, which pretty much is tilted. I mean, I think we have to say it's if you don't have the capitalist system says, what can you bring to us, and we'll reward you for this,
Yes.
and it's pretty arbitrary. Well, if you said, I'll tell you what, I'm good at poetry. I can write poetry very well. Well, unfortunately, there's no demand for that, so you're not going to make it as a poet. What else can you do?
Well, let's artificially raise the demand. WPA
well,
will pay the poets.
The system says, well, poets aren't going to do too well.
Yes.
And on the other hand, you might say, well, I've got a very supple back, and I can go out and I can work in a field all day long and bend my back,
Yes.
and I can do that. But it turns out that machines can do it better.
Yes.
So some of the things that are going on here with the contributions that people made in the past, physical contributions,
Yes.
are
Passe,
they're being rendered not appropriate for
Yes.
this system.
It's the rise of the robots.
So many people are just being just cut out of the society, and right-thinking people would say we have to figure out a way where people can have meaningful lives. It's a tough thing to do.
Well, I think my final statement would simply be whatever system we come up with, it has to account for the fact that humans are selfish. You're never going to have the Orwellian system whereby selfishness is simply removed from the human equation, because as long as human beings are biologically intaking something that isn't them and making them, you've got selfishness at the most fundamental level possible. And to be a utopian and assume that we can get beyond that is just naive.
Okay, thank you, Bucky.
Thank you, sir.
Nice conversation. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.